The year is a 59, and you are standing on a riverbank so wide the opposite shore dissolves into mist. The air is heavy, thick with the green smell of rain forest, with wet earth and wood smoke and something sweet you can't quite name. Beneath your feet, the ground is dark, almost black, rich as chocolate cake, and it hums with life. Insects drone in the canopy above you. Somewhere downriver, a drum is speaking, not playing, speaking, not playing, speaking, a message traveling faster than any horse in Europe could carry a letter. And if you listen, really listen the way you would if your life depended on understanding what was being said, you can hear the second drum pick up the phrase a kilometer away, relay it forward, pass it to a third somewhere deeper in the forest, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, the sound rippling outward through the green dark like a stone dropped in still water, each repetition adding distance, adding urgency, carrying meaning through the humid air at a speed that would not be matched by European communication technology for another 300 years. You are deep inside the Kingdom of Congo, one of the largest, most sophisticated, most politically complex civilizations in the history of the African continent. A kingdom with a written constitution of customs, a standing army, a system of courts and appeals, a managed currency, a diplomatic corps that had exchanged ambassadors with the Vatican itself. And the message the drums are carrying tonight is urgent. Portuguese warships have been spotted off the coast. Again. They are coming upriver. They are armed. They are bringing soldiers and cannons and the particular kind of European confidence that comes from believing God and gunpowder are on your side. And they have done this before. Twice already, the Portuguese navy has attempted to force its way into the heart of this kingdom, and twice, against every assumption you have ever been taught about the history of European expansion, they have been beaten back, turned away, defeated, not by terrain alone, not by tropical disease, not by the kind of passive resistance that European historians later liked to invoke when they needed to explain away African military success without actually crediting African military skill, known scillation. They were defeated by organized resistance, by coordinated strategy, by a kingdom that understood power, logistics, terrain, and the psychology of warfare as deeply and as seriously as any nation in Europe. Tonight, as the drums speak across the darkening forest, the kingdom is preparing for a third confrontation. And here is the part that will keep you listening. After this third encounter, after centuries of sophistication, diplomacy, art, governance, spiritual richness, and stubborn, brilliant military resistance, this kingdom will be slowly, deliberately, almost methodically erased from the maps of the world, not because it fell, not because it was conquered in some dramatic final battle, but because the story of its existence was inconvenient for the people who were writing the history books. So they simply stopped telling it. How do you erase an entire civilization? You are about to find out. Welcome in. If you are listening to this in bed right now, phone propped up on the nightstand, eyes getting heavy, maybe a blanket pulled up to your chin, the world outside your window finally going quiet, then you are in exactly the right place. This is Hidden Past Revealed, and this is exactly what this channel was made for. Long, slow, real stories to carry you into sleep. If you haven't already, subscribing to Hidden Past Revealed takes just 2 seconds, and it means the next time your mind won't stop spinning, the next time the ceiling feels too close and the thoughts won't settle, there will be something new waiting for you. It genuinely helps more than you know, and I would love it if you dropped a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and I am always genuinely curious about the little constellation of people tuning in from different corners of the world at this exact moment. Now, here is what most people think they know about pre-colonial Africa, and here is why almost all of it is dead wrong. The popular imagination, shaped by centuries of colonial propaganda and reinforced by generations of lazy, unquestioning textbook writing, paints a picture of a continent that was somehow waiting, passive, undeveloped, frozen in a kind of historical amber, existing in a permanent state of prehistory, until Europeans arrived with their ships and their flags and their Bibles, and set history itself in motion. You have absorbed this implication 1,000 times, even if nobody ever said it directly to your face. It lives in the way Africa is discussed in classrooms, always as a place where things were done to people, never as a place where people were doing extraordinary things on their own terms. It lives in the surprise people express when they learn that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, or that Timbuktu was a center of scholarship, or that the Kingdom of Benin had a road system and a specialized guild of bronze casters whose work rivaled anything being produced in Renaissance Europe. The surprise itself is the tell, the fact that these things feel like revelations rather than common knowledge. That is the fingerprint of a propaganda campaign so successful that most people do not even recognize it as propaganda, and the Kingdom of Congo destroys every piece of it. Because here is what the archaeological, documentary and material evidence actually shows. By the time the first Portuguese ships dropped anchor off the mouth of the Congo River in 1483 under the command of the navigator Diogo Cao, who planted a limestone pillar called a padrao on the southern bank to mark his king's claim to a coast he did not own and could not hold, the Kingdom of Congo had already been a functioning centralized, bureaucratically administered state for at least 100 years, probably longer. Its origins reach back into the 14th century, possibly the 13th, rooted in the long, slow political consolidation of Bantu-speaking peoples who had been shaping the landscape of Central Africa, clearing forests, establishing trade networks, developing agricultural systems, forging iron-building communities. For millennia before any European set foot on the continent, by the time of European contact, the kingdom's territory stretched across an area roughly the size of modern-day France, not a loose patchwork of allied villages, but a coherent political entity with recognized borders, a central government, and a sophisticated administrative hierarchy. It encompassed dense tropical forest in the north, sweeping river valleys, open savanna grasslands to the south and east, and the fertile plateau regions that formed its political and spiritual heartland. Its capital, Mbanza, Congo, sat on a broad, flat-topped plateau in what is now northern Angola, a site chosen not by accident but by political and strategic logic, elevated above the surrounding terrain, blessed with reliable water sources, commanding a view that stretched for miles in every direction. This was not a village, not a camp, not a settlement that European visitors politely elevated to capital in their dispatches to make the place sound more impressive than it was. Mbanza, Congo was an urban center, a genuine city. Population estimates vary among historians, and precision is impossible, but the most careful scholarly assessments suggest that at its peak, the city housed somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people. It had distinct residential quarters organized by social function and status. It had daily markets, open squares where merchants from across the kingdom and beyond gathered to trade raffia cloth, iron tools, copper ornaments and ingots, salt harvested from coastal pans, dried fish from the river's palm wine ceramic vessels, medicinal plants and dozens of other commodities in a system of exchange so vigorous and so regular that European visitors compared it favorably to markets they had seen in Lisbon and Seville. It had a system of provincial governors, 6 major provinces, each subdivided further, appointed by the king, the Manikongo. These were not hereditary lords sitting on ancestral estates passing power from father to son. They were appointed officials, removable by the Manikongo for incompetence, disloyalty, or failure to meet their obligations. Each governor was responsible for tax collection within their territory. Taxes paid in the form of nzimbu shells, raffia cloth, ivory, and labor. Each was responsible for raising military forces when called upon by the central government. Each administered local justice through a system of courts that heard everything from property disputes to accusations of sorcery, with a structured appeals process that could escalate cases all the way to the Manikongo's own court in Banza Congo. Think about that for a moment. Appointed provincial governors, a tax system, military conscription, courts with appeals, central oversight with the power of removal. This is not a tribal confederation. This is not a chiefdom with pretensions. This is a state, fully realized, institutionally complex, administratively sophisticated, functioning on a scale and with a degree of political organization that would have been recognizable to any contemporary European observer. And many European observers did recognize it. They just chose over time to stop saying so. The kingdom had a currency, not barter currency. Nzimbu shells, small and lustrous, harvested from the waters around Luanda Island off the Atlantic coast. And here is the detail that should make any modern economist sit up straight. The supply of Nzimbu was deliberately controlled. The island was guarded. Access was restricted by royal decree. The Manikongo's government managed the currency supply with a sophistication that was functionally equivalent to what a modern central bank does when it adjusts the money supply to control inflation. Too many shells in circulation and the currency loses value. Too few and commerce seizes up. The Congolese understood this. They managed it. They had been managing it for generations before any Portuguese ship appeared on the horizon. The textile industry alone would be enough to demolish the myth of a primitive society. Raffia cloth, woven from the fibers of the raffia palm, was produced across the kingdom in quantities that stagger the imagination. The finest pieces produced by specialist weavers whose skills were handed down through lineages and whose output was reserved for the court and the nobility were so tightly woven, so soft, so intricately patterned with geometric designs of extraordinary mathematical complexity that European visitors who handled them compared them without hesitation to the finest velvet and silk produced anywhere in Europe. These were not rough homespun fabrics. These were luxury goods, status markers, trade commodities that held their value across hundreds of kilometers of exchange networks. Some pieces were worth more than their weight in imported copper, and copper, in this part of Central Africa, was itself a prestige material. Metalworking was equally advanced. Iron, smelted in clay furnaces using techniques developed independently of European or Asian metallurgy, was worked into tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects of real artistry. Iron bells, in particular, held deep political and spiritual significance. The double iron bell, known as the debu, was a symbol of royal authority. Its sound was literally the voice of the state. Copper, imported from the mines of the Katanga region far to the southeast, was worked into bracelets, anklets, necklaces, and elaborate decorative pieces that marked rank and status within the social hierarchy. The kingdom was not just consuming metal. It was producing it, trading it, and investing it with political meaning in ways that parallel what gold and silver meant to European monarchies. And when the Portuguese arrived, the Congolese did not gape at them in wonder. They did not fall to their knees before pale-skinned gods. That narrative, the myth of first contact as a moment of primitive awe, is a European fantasy that says far more about European vanity than about African reality. What actually happened was something much more pragmatic. The Congolese court assessed the Portuguese the way any state assesses a new arrival on its borders. Who are these people? What do they want? What do they have that we might use? What threat do they pose? And the answers, at first, were encouraging. The Portuguese had goods, metalware, cloth of unfamiliar weave, glass beads, and most importantly, firearms that the Manikongo recognized as potentially useful in his own regional politics, and they were willing to trade, so the Manikongo engaged them. Not as a supplicant, as a sovereign. Ambassadors were exchanged, real ambassadors, Congolese envoys who traveled to Lisbon by ship, who were received at the Portuguese court, who presented gifts and conveyed messages and negotiated terms on behalf of their king, the Manikongo Nenzinga and Ikuwu, and later his son Afonso sent members of the royal family and high-ranking officials to Portugal for education. The most famous of these was Henrique Afonso's son, who studied in Lisbon and Rome, mastered Portuguese and Latin, was educated in European theology, philosophy and canon law, and in 1518 was ordained as a bishop by Pope Leo X, the first black African bishop in the history of the Catholic Church. Think about what that means. A Congolese prince, educated in European institutions, ordained by the Pope himself, returning to his homeland to serve as both a religious leader and a bridge between two civilizations. This is not a story of domination and submission. This is a story of engagement, of two states separated by an ocean attempting for a few fragile decades to build a relationship based on something other than naked exploitation. Letters passed between the courts in Lisbon and Banza, Congo for years. Formal diplomatic correspondence, written in Portuguese, discussing matters of trade, religion, military cooperation, the exchange of craftsmen and teachers. Portuguese masons and carpenters were invited to Banza, Congo, where they worked alongside Congolese builders to construct churches and public buildings that blended European architectural styles with local materials and aesthetic sensibilities. Missionaries arrived, Franciscans, Dominicans, later Jesuits, and found a population that was in many cases genuinely interested in the Christian message, partly because Congolese cosmology already contained concepts that resonated with Christian theology. The idea of a supreme creator, the importance of the ancestral world, the existence of spiritual forces that operated alongside the material world. But paper can be made to say almost anything, and underneath the diplomatic pleasantries, underneath the letters calling each other brother and invoking their shared baptism in Christ, something darker was already spreading through the kingdom like a slow poison. The Atlantic slave trade did not arrive as an invasion. It arrived as a transaction. At first, it was managed, controlled by the Manikongo himself, who regulated the sale of captives the way he regulated the Nzimbu currency, carefully, strategically, with an eye to maintaining his authority and extracting maximum value from the exchange. War captives, convicted criminals, people who were already in servitude under Congolese customary law. These were the people offered to Portuguese traders in exchange for European goods that reinforced the Manikongo's power over his own provincial governors and political rivals. It was ugly commerce. All slave trades everywhere in human history have been ugly, but it was commerce conducted between parties who each believed they held leverage, each negotiating terms, each pursuing their own strategic interests. The problem was the scale. The Portuguese did not want dozens of captives, they wanted thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The sugar plantations of São Tomé, a small volcanic island in the Gulf of Guinea that the Portuguese had turned into the first large-scale sugar colony in the Atlantic, needed labor in quantities that no regulated, managed trade could possibly supply. And when São Tomé's appetite was joined by Brazil's, when the vast continental sugar economy of the New World opened its maw, the demand became functionally infinite. There was no ceiling. There was no enough. Every ship that left the coast of Congo loaded with human beings was immediately followed by another ship and another, each one carrying trade goods designed to entice more sellers, to reach deeper into the kingdom's social fabric to find new sources of human cargo. And the system broke. Portuguese traders stopped working through the Manikongo's court. They established direct relationships with provincial chiefs, with ambitious nobles, with anyone who could deliver bodies in exchange for imported cloth, iron bars, alcohol, and, most devastatingly, firearms. The regulated trade became a free-for-all. Villages that had been centers of weaving, farming, and community life became targets. people who had been free citizens of a functioning state, people with names, with families, with trades, with legal rights under Congolese law, were seized, bound, marched to the coast, and loaded into the holds of ships bound for a world they would never return from. Afonso I, the Congolese king who had embraced Christianity with genuine sincerity, who had reorganized his court along Catholic lines, who had sent his son to be educated in Rome, who had believed with apparently real conviction that the alliance between Congo and Portugal could be a relationship of mutual benefit between Christian brothers, watched his kingdom being consumed. And he did the most extraordinary thing a 16th century African monarch could do in that situation. He wrote, "The letters of Afonso I to the Portuguese crown are among the most remarkable documents in all of diplomatic history, African, European, or otherwise. They are preserved in Portuguese archives, and they speak across 5 centuries with a clarity and moral force that is staggering." In a letter from 1526, Afonso describes to King João III of Portugal how the slave trade has grown so rapacious, so utterly beyond any regulation or restraint, that Portuguese merchants and their local agents are now seizing people without any pretense of legal process, no trial, no conviction, no distinction between free citizens and those lawfully held in servitude. Nobles have been taken, members of the extended royal family have been kidnapped and shipped away before anyone could intervene. The social order is collapsing. Communities that once trusted each other now lock their doors at night and hide their children during the day. And Afonso does not rage. He does not declare war. He reasons. He argues. He appeals to every form of moral authority available to him. Shared Christian faith, royal honor, the obligations of alliance, the simple human decency that one king owes another. He asks for teachers, for doctors, for priests who will actually serve the spiritual needs of his people, rather than turning a blind eye to the traders who are destroying them. He asks, in language that vibrates with controlled desperation, for the Portuguese king to restrain his own subjects, to enforce the terms of the alliance that was supposed to bind their kingdoms together in brotherhood. The response from Lisbon was functionally nothing. Polite words, vague assurances, and more ships. But Afonso's letters were not the end of the story. They were not even the most dramatic chapter, because the military confrontations between Congo and Portugal, the encounters that have been most thoroughly and deliberately scrubbed from the history that most people learn, were not border skirmishes or diplomatic incidents that got out of hand. They were genuine engagements between organized military forces, and the results were not what any European account would lead you to expect. Here is the narrative you have been given about European expansion, even if nobody ever stated it this plainly. European technology, specifically guns, steel, and ships, made European military dominance inevitable wherever European forces went. The story of colonialism in this telling is essentially a story of physics, superior projectile weapons plus superior naval technology plus superior organizational discipline equals conquest. End of equation. And yes, in many places across many centuries, that equation held. The technological advantages were real, and they were devastating. The conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires, the colonization of Australia, the subjugation of vast stretches of Asia, these were catastrophes enabled, in large part, by disparities in military technology magnified by epidemic disease and political exploitation. But the equation did not hold everywhere, and one of the places it shattered most dramatically was on the waters and in the forests of the Kingdom of Congo. The Congolese military was not a disorganized mass of warriors charging screaming into gunfire. It was a structured, disciplined, tactically sophisticated fighting force that had been shaped by centuries of interregional warfare, territorial expansion, dynastic conflict, and the practical demands of controlling a territory the size of France. Congolese armies were organized into distinct tactical units, each with a specific battlefield role. At the front stood the shield bearers, and these shields were not token defenses. They were large, tall, rectangular constructions made from layers of woven raffia fiber and treated animal hide, sometimes reinforced with wooden frames, designed to absorb the impact of projectiles and provide mobile cover for the troops behind them. The shields were light enough to carry on a forced march through dense forest and strong enough to stop an arrow or, at sufficient distance, an early musket ball. Behind the shield lines stood the missile troops, archers with powerful composite bows and javelin throwers who could put an iron-tipped projectile through a gap in armor at distances that would make a European crossbowman nervous. On the flanks, particularly in the open savanna regions, cavalry provided mobility and the ability to envelop an enemy's position. And coordinating it all, this is the part that European commanders never adequately accounted for, were the drums. The Congolese drum communication system was not a crude signaling device. It was a language. The tonal patterns of the drums replicated the tonal patterns of the Kikongo language itself, allowing drummers to transmit specific complex messages, not just attack or retreat, but detailed tactical instructions, intelligence reports, coordination signals, across distances of several kilometers in real time. A Congolese commander standing on a hilltop overlooking a river battle could communicate with units hidden in tributaries 3 kilometers away and receive confirmation of his orders within minutes. European commanders in the same period had flag signals that were useless in forest, courier riders who could be ambushed or delayed, and trumpet calls that carried a few hundred meters at best. In terms of battlefield communication, the Congolese had a decisive technological advantage that European observers noted with admiration in their private accounts, and then conveniently failed to mention in their published histories. But the ultimate advantage was the terrain itself. The Congo River Basin is one of the most hydrologically complex systems on Earth. The main channel of the Congo stretches over 4,000 kilometers, making it the second longest river in Africa. But the main channel is only the beginning. Thousands of tributaries, some of them substantial rivers in their own right, branch and merge and fork through forests so dense, so relentlessly green, so saturated with moisture that the air itself feels solid. Visibility in the deep forest drops to a few meters. Sound behaves strangely, absorbed by the vegetation, distorted by humidity, making it nearly impossible for an outsider to judge distance or direction. The riverbanks shift with the seasons. A solid shore in the dry months becomes a treacherous mudflat after the rains, capable of swallowing a man in armor up to his waist. The channels narrow without warning, widening again around islands that appear and disappear as the water level rises and falls. The Congolese knew every meter of it. Generations of fishermen, traders, and warriors had mapped this labyrinth, not on paper, but in memory, in the accumulated practical knowledge passed from parent to child, from village to village, from one generation of river people to the next. They knew where the current was strongest and where it slackened. They knew which tributaries were navigable in which seasons. They knew where the overhanging canopy created natural cover, so dense that a fleet of war canoes could sit motionless beneath it, invisible to any vessel passing on the main channel, waiting for the exact moment to strike. The first major naval confrontation came when Portuguese forces attempted to push armed vessels up the Congo River to establish a fortified trading post deeper in Congolese territory, without the Mana Congo's explicit authorization. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate test of Congolese sovereignty. Could the Portuguese establish a permanent military presence inside the kingdom without permission? Could they carve out a zone of control that answered to Lisbon rather than to Mbanza Congo? The answer came swiftly. Congolese war canoes, and you need to understand the scale of these vessels. These were not the small fishing dugouts that European illustrators would later use to caricature African watercraft in their engravings. Congolese war canoes were massive, carved from single trunks of tropical hardwood, iroko, mahogany, sapele trees, so large that a single trunk could yield a vessel capable of carrying 60 to 70 armed warriors. Some accounts describe canoes over 20 meters long. They sat low in the water, presenting almost no profile to a gunner on the deck of a caravel, and they were propelled by skilled paddlers who could accelerate the craft from a standstill to ramming speed in a matter of seconds. These war canoes came from multiple directions simultaneously, from side channels, from behind islands, from beneath the overhang of the forest canopy where they had been waiting, silent, invisible, for hours or even days. The Portuguese had cannons, bronze pieces mounted on the gunwales of their caravels, but these weapons had been designed for open ocean naval combat. They were meant to fire broadside at other sailing ships at ranges of several hundred meters, in conditions where the gunner had a clear line of sight and time to aim, fire, reload, and aim again. On a winding tropical river, surrounded by 60-foot walls of vegetation, with war canoes closing from 3 directions at once, the cannons were nearly useless. The reload time for a 16th-century cannon was agonizingly long. Several minutes of swabbing, loading, ramming, priming, and aiming, all performed by a gun crew standing on a deck that was being peppered with arrows and javelins from enemies they could barely see. By the time the cannon was ready to fire again, the canoes were alongside. Warriors were boarding. The fight was hand-to-hand, machetes and iron-tipped spears against European swords and half-plate armor in the suffocating heat of a tropical river. And the Portuguese withdrew. They retreated down the river, back to the coast, back to the open ocean where their technology actually worked. The second attempt came with reinforcements and fresh orders from a Portuguese crown that was not accustomed to hearing the word defeated from its overseas expeditions. More ships, more soldiers, more ammunition, and it ended the same way. The Congolese military, coordinated by that drum communication network supplied by a chain of riverside communities that functioned as a combined logistics pipeline and intelligence network, reporting Portuguese movements upstream in real time, executed a defense that was not just brave but tactically brilliant. They chose their ground. They controlled the tempo. They forced the Portuguese to fight on terms that negated every technological advantage the Europeans possessed, and the Portuguese retreated again. The third encounter, and this is the one that seems to have been most comprehensively erased from European records, surviving only in fragmentary references and the conspicuous silence of archives that should contain detailed reports but do not, was the most decisive. By this point, the relationship between the two kingdoms had deteriorated beyond any pretense of alliance. The slave trade had corroded the foundation of trust. Afonso's letters had been answered with nothing but more exploitation. Portuguese agents were operating openly as destabilizing forces within Congolese territory, arming rival factions, undermining the Manicongo's authority, treating the kingdom as a resource to be extracted rather than a sovereign state to be respected. When Portuguese forces pushed upriver for the third time, the Congolese were ready, and the result was the same: defeat, retreat, withdrawal. 3 attempts to force military control over a sovereign African kingdom, 3 failures. And then something happened that was, in its own quiet way, more devastating than any military conquest could have been. The maps changed. The Kingdom of Congo, which had appeared on European maps for decades as a clearly defined political entity, borders drawn, capital named, provinces labelled, the Manicongo acknowledged as a sovereign ruler by European courts and the Vatican alike, began to fade, not suddenly, gradually. The borders became vague, then disappeared. The provincial names were dropped. The label Kingdom of Congo shrank to smaller and smaller type, pushed the margins of the map, and then, in many European cartographic traditions, it vanished entirely, replaced by the names of rivers, by coastal features, by the word Africa in large, empty, meaningless letters stretched across a space that was anything but empty. Within a few generations, the Kingdom of Congo, a state that had exchanged ambassadors with Portugal, sent a bishop to Rome, maintained a court system and a standing army and a managed currency, had effectively disappeared from the European geographical imagination. Here is what nobody tells you about this erasure. It was not accidental. It was not a matter of ignorance or incomplete exploration or the honest limitations of cartographic knowledge. European mapmakers in the 16th and 17th centuries had access to extraordinarily detailed information about the Kingdom of Congo. Missionaries who had lived in Banza Congo for years, who had learned the language, attended court ceremonies, traveled the provinces, and written lengthy reports back to their superiors in Rome and Lisbon, provided granular descriptions of the kingdom's geography, politics, social structure and customs. Traders who had spent decades operating in Congolese territory knew the river systems, the trade routes, the market towns. Diplomats who had been received at the Manikongo's court knew the names of the provinces, the titles of the officials, the protocols of governance. This was not unknown territory. It was thoroughly documented territory that was deliberately undocumented, and the reason is as simple as it is devastating. As the Atlantic slave trade grew from a significant commercial enterprise into the single most important economic engine of the colonial world, the force that generated the capital, that built plantations, funded wars, constructed cities, underwrote banks, and created the financial infrastructure of the modern Western economy, the existence of sophisticated, organized, literate, militarily capable African kingdoms became a problem. Not a minor embarrassment, an existential threat to the moral framework that made the entire system possible, because the slave trade required a story, it required a justification, and the justification was this: that the people being transported across the Atlantic in chains were not fully civilized, that they came from a continent without real states, without real governance, without real history, without the kind of cultural and political complexity that would make their enslavement a crime against nations rather than a regrettable but defensible commercial practice. If the Kingdom of Congo was real, if it had courts and laws and currency and diplomacy and architecture, and a literate king writing letters in fluent Portuguese, then the people being taken from its territory were citizens. They were subjects of a recognized sovereign. They had legal identities, cultural inheritance, political rights, and their enslavement was not the rescue of primitives from darkness. It was the destruction of a civilization for profit. That truth was too dangerous, so the maps were redrawn, the histories were edited, and a kingdom that had defeated the Portuguese navy 3 times, that had sent ambassadors to the Vatican, that had produced one of the most remarkable bodies of diplomatic correspondence in African history, was quietly buried in the archives, not destroyed. You cannot destroy what is written in stone and ink and fired clay, but buried deep enough that almost nobody would find it unless they knew exactly where to look. But archaeology does not care about political convenience. And in the decades since the mid-20th century, as African historians and a new generation of scholars trained outside the colonial tradition began to ask different questions, to look in different archives, to dig in different soil, the evidence has come pouring out like water from a broken dam. Excavations at Mbanza, Congo, which was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017, a designation that itself represents a kind of cartographic restoration, a putting back on the map of a place that was deliberately taken off, have revealed the material remains of a city far more sophisticated than the colonial narrative ever acknowledged. Stone foundations, churches built by Congolese craftsmen who learned Portuguese architectural techniques and then adapted them, not just copied them, adapted them, blending European structural principles with local materials, local aesthetics, local spatial logic, elaborate drainage channels cut into the plateau rock, speaking to an understanding of urban engineering, of the need to manage water flow in a tropical climate with intense seasonal rainfall. Evidence of organized urban planning, streets that follow intentional patterns, buildings that relate to each other in ways that suggest zoning, functional differentiation, the kind of deliberate spatial thinking that distinguishes a city from a settlement. The artifacts tell an even richer story. Iron tools and weapons demonstrating metallurgical techniques, carbon control, heat treatment, decorative inlay that were developed independently of European or Asian traditions. Copper jewelry of extraordinary precision, worked into forms of such delicacy that modern jewelers marvel at the skill involved. Imported glass beads from Venice, from the Indian Ocean trade networks, from North Africa, testifying to commercial connections that stretched across the entire breadth of the continent and the seas beyond. The Kingdom of Congo was not isolated, it was connected, plugged into a web of trade and cultural exchange that spanned thousands of kilometers. And the textiles. This is where the material evidence becomes almost heartbreaking in its beauty. Fragments of raffia cloth recovered from royal tombs and ceremonial burial sites exhibit weaving patterns of such geometric complexity, such mathematical precision, such aesthetic sophistication, that modern textile scholars, people who've spent their careers studying the world's great weaving traditions, are still working to fully understand the techniques and the looms that produced them. Some pieces have thread densities that rival the finest European tapestries of the same period. The patterns are not random or decorative in the simple sense. They encode information, social status, clan affiliation, spiritual meaning, in a visual language that was legible to any Congolese citizen, but that European visitors either could not read or chose not to acknowledge. And the letters, once you know where to look, the written record is overwhelming. The correspondence of Afonso I, those urgent, eloquent, devastating pleas to the Portuguese crown, is only the beginning. Later, many Congos continued to write. Congolese officials produced administrative documents. Missionaries who sympathized with the kingdom produced accounts that contradict the official colonial narrative in striking ways. The archive exists. It has always existed. It was simply filed in places where people who wanted to tell a different story did not bother to look. But here is perhaps the most extraordinary dimension of the Congo story. The part that reaches across the Atlantic and touches communities that exist today, right now, in the Americas. Because the Kingdom of Congo did not die when it was erased from European maps. Its people did not disappear. Hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps millions, over the centuries, were shipped across the ocean in chains, and they carried their civilization with them, not in boxes, not in books, in their minds, in their bodies, in the deep structures of their understanding of how the universe works. The Congolese cosmogram, the you and moi, a crossed circle that represents the cycle of life and death. The daily journey of the sun from the world of the living across the great water of the boundary to the world of the ancestors and back again. The eternal turning of existence through birth, maturity, death, and rebirth. This symbol has been found by archaeologists and anthropologists across the Americas, scratched into the bases of pottery vessels in South Carolina, drawn in chalk or ash on the floors of slave quarters in Virginia and Maryland, carved into walking sticks and wooden grave markers in the American South, embedded in the ritual vocabulary of candomblé in Bahia, Brazil, woven into the spiritual architecture of Vodou in Haiti. Wherever Congolese people were taken, the cosmogram went with them. A portable theology, a diagram of existence that could be drawn in dirt with a fingertip, that required no priest and no church and no book, that could survive the Middle Passage, survive the auction block, survive the plantation, survive centuries of deliberate cultural suppression, because it lived not in any object that could be confiscated, but in the understanding of every person who knew what it meant. Think about that. Sit with it for a moment. A circle, a cross, 4 points representing the 4 moments of the sun: dawn, noon, sunset, midnight. The upper half representing the living world, the lower half representing the world of the dead, the horizontal line representing Kalunga, the great water that separates them, and the whole thing turning, always turning, because existence does not end at death. It continues, it cycles. The ancestors are always present, always watching, always part of the ongoing conversation between the visible and the invisible. This idea, this entire cosmological framework, was carried across an ocean in the memories of people who had been stripped of literally everything else. Their names were taken, their families were shattered, their freedom was destroyed, their homeland was made unreachable, and still they held on to this. Still they drew this circle in the dirt and knew what it meant. Still they passed it to their children and their children's children, across generations of enslavement and oppression, until it surfaced again and again in the archaeological record of 2 continents. That is not the mark of a primitive culture. That is the signature of a civilization so deeply rooted in its people, so philosophically coherent, so spiritually resilient, that it could survive the single worst sustained catastrophe in human history, the Atlantic slave trade, and still leave its indelible imprint in the soil and the souls of another hemisphere. The Kingdom of Congo beat the Portuguese navy 3 times, but its most remarkable victory is the one still unfolding, the slow, patient, unstoppable recovery of its story from the silence where it was buried. There is something in all of this that speaks directly to you, not just as a piece of forgotten history, though it is that, not just as a corrective to centuries of propaganda, though it is that too. It speaks to something deeper, to the way all of us construct our understanding of who we are and where we came from and what human beings are capable of. You carry the echoes of erasure in your own mind, not as a personal failing, but as an inheritance. The assumptions you did not choose, the gaps in your knowledge that you did not create, the surprise. Maybe you felt it tonight, maybe you are feeling it right now, at learning that a pre-colonial African kingdom could field a standing army, maintain a system of courts, manage a currency, correspond diplomatically with European monarchs in their own language, produce textiles that rivaled European luxury goods, and defeat a European navy in direct military engagement. That surprise is real, and it is not your fault. It is the residue of a deliberate, centuries-long campaign of selective memory. Someone decided a long time ago that you were not supposed to know this. Someone decided that the story of human civilization would be easier to tell, and more useful to certain people, if the Kingdom of Congo was left out of it. The antidote is not guilt. Guilt changes nothing and helps no one. The antidote is not outrage, though outrage is a natural and understandable response. The antidote is curiosity, the quiet, persistent, almost stubborn willingness to look at the evidence. The letters sitting in archives, the pottery fragments in museum basements, the cosmograms scratched into clay on 2 different continents, the textile fragments that still shimmer with 500-year-old skill, and to allow the story to be what it actually was. Not simple, not comfortable, not a fairy tale of noble savages or a morality play of pure victims and pure villains, but real, complicated, magnificent in places, devastating in others, human in every sense of that enormous, messy, contradictory word. The Kingdom of Congo was not a paradise. No kingdom ever was. It had internal power struggles, provincial rebellions, contested successions, social hierarchies that placed some people above others, forms of servitude that modern eyes would find abhorrent. It was a human institution, built by human beings, and it carried all the flaws that human beings carry everywhere they go. But it was real, it was sophisticated, it was resilient, and it deserves to exist in the story you carry about what human beings have done on this planet, not as a footnote, not as an exception, not as an anomaly that needs to be explained away, but as one of 1,000 examples of human ingenuity and political imagination that were buried so deep you were never supposed to find them. The fact that you are hearing this right now is itself a small act of excavation. You are digging up something that powerful institutions spent centuries trying to keep underground, and that matters. So let your breathing slow now. Let the pace of these words become something gentler, something that matches the rhythm of your body settling into rest. Feel the weight of your limbs against the mattress, The specific, particular heaviness of your own arms, your own legs, your own ribcage expanding and contracting with each slow breath. Feel your skull finding its place in the pillow, that small adjustment, that tiny surrender of tension. The room around you is dark, and that darkness is ancient. It is the same darkness that settled over Mbanza, Congo 500 years ago. The same darkness that pooled in the river valleys, that crept through the forest, that filled the spaces between the houses on the plateau as the sun dropped below the western horizon and the sky turned from gold to copper to violet to black. Somewhere in that darkness, someone was lying down to sleep on a woven mat, a mat made from the same raffia fibers that were woven into those extraordinary textiles, in a house built by hands that understood architecture, in a city governed by laws, in a kingdom that knew exactly what it was and what it was worth. They were tired, the way you are tired now. The specific tiredness of a day spent doing, working, talking, walking, deciding, carrying, building, all the physical and mental labor that fills a human day in any century, in any civilization. Their muscles ached, their eyelids were heavy, their mind was still turning over the events of the day, what was said at the market, what was decided at the court, what the drums had carried in from the provinces, what was left undone and would need attention in the morning. And before sleep took them, they listened to the insects, that endless layered chorus that rises from the tropical night like breath from the earth itself, to the river moving somewhere below the plateau. It sounds so constant and so deep that it was less a noise than a vibration, felt in the chest more than heard by the ear, to the faint distant pulse of a drum, the last message of the evening, carrying news from a province 100 kilometers away, spoken in a language made of rhythm and tone and the spaces between the beats, a language you could feel in your sternum if you were close enough, a language that said, "We are here, we are still here. The kingdom holds. You are not so different from that person. The technology around you has changed. The sounds outside your window belong to a different world. The specific weight of your specific worries is yours alone, and nobody else will ever carry it quite the way you do. But the body is the same body. The need for rest is the same ancient need. The darkness is the same darkness it has always been. The same darkness that has fallen over every city and every village and every campfire and every palace and every humble shelter that human beings have ever built on the surface of this spinning planet. And the act of lying still, of letting the noise of the waking world fade, of allowing a voice and a story to carry you from the bright tension of consciousness into something softer, something warmer, something that asks nothing of you. That act is as old as the species, as old as language, as old as the first time one human being sat beside another in the dark and said, "Let me tell you something." The stars that hung above Mbanza, Congo are the same stars above your roof tonight. The breath that fills your lungs follows the same ancient rhythm, in and out, the same pattern your ancestors breathed 10,000 years ago and 100,000 years before that, and the sleep that is coming for you now. You can feel it, can't you? That warm heaviness gathering at the edges of your awareness, that gentle pulling down, is the same sleep that has gathered every human being who has ever lived into its arms and held them through the dark hours until morning came again. Thank you sincerely from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with Hidden Past Revealed tonight. If this story helped you drift off, or if it taught you something that surprised you, a like truly goes a long way. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one, stories that have been buried for centuries, deserve to be heard, and it helps other people find their way here on their own restless, sleepless nights. If you have a moment before sleep takes you all the way, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from? What time is it in your corner of the world? What are you thinking about as you close your eyes? I read every single one of those comments, and there is something genuinely unexpectedly beautiful about seeing messages come in from Lagos and London and Los Angeles and Lahore and Lisbon and Lima, all at different hours. all from people lying in their own dark rooms, all reaching for the same quiet place. If you have not subscribed to Hidden Past Revealed yet, this is your gentle nudge. It just means that the next time you cannot sleep, the next time the world is too loud and your mind will not stop, there will be something waiting for you. And if you want to take one more step, there is an optional membership that helps keep these stories coming, keeps the research going, keeps the archive growing, one buried kingdom at a time. No pressure, none at all. It is there if you feel moved, and I am grateful for you either way. Now close your eyes if they are not closed already. Let the last image in your mind be something ancient and warm. Firelight on a stone wall. The wide, slow river catching the last copper glow of a sun that has been setting over this same water for 10,000 years. The sound of a drum fading into the forest canopy, carrying one final message into the gathering night. A message that says simply, we were here. We were always here. Humans have been lying down under this same sky, telling each other stories in the dark, since the very beginning. Tonight, you are part of that unbroken line. Rest well. Sleep deep, and I will see you in the next one.